2's, 3's, and 4's are the natural progression of the bass drum learning process after you've finished learning how to place eighth note partials. Although they're fairly easy to internalize, there's a surprising amount of value you can squeeze out of these three subdivisions if you approach them with the right technique and rhythmic interpretation. My name is Elliot Duran, and today I'll be going through some concepts you can apply to these eighth note subdivisions that should help you whether you're just starting to learn them or are simply looking to maximize your skill set. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Let's first set up some basic vocabulary for those who are looking at these rudiments for the very first time. 2's, 3's, and 4's refer to subdivisions of an eighth note, and their names imply how many notes your eighth note is being subdivided into. 2's subdivide the eighth note into 2 16th notes, 3's subdivide the eighth note into 3 sextuplet partials, and 4's subdivide the eighth note into 4 32nd notes. These definitions help simplify what we're looking at today. We're simply fitting 2, 3, or 4 notes exactly into the space that an eighth note occupies, not bigger and not smaller. Each of these subdivisions has its own nuances in terms of playing technique and timing checkpoints, so let's jump right into these by starting with some doubles. So as we discussed, a 2 is simply 2 16th notes. Pretty simple, right? Wrong. 2's can be deceiving in this way. Beginning players usually see less notes and think that this correlates to an easier rhythm. The reality is that with less notes to fill up the eighth note space, you have a lot more freedom to place the second note, and therefore more chances of being inaccurate. This can cause all sorts of different interpretations of 16th note timing, which leads to choppiness when a bass line comes together to play through a doubles passage. So this brings us to our first task, making sure we have the correct interpretation of 2 16th notes. This is the first primer that we'll be working on. Let's take a closer look and establish some goals before we begin rehearsing it. We've taken our doubles and tagged an eighth note onto the end of them. This eighth note tag is known as a Brent, and by adding this note on, you accomplish two different things. First, you give yourself an eighth note checkpoint so that the first note of your 2 stays consistent whether it begins on the downbeat or the upbeat. Second, because you've established this consistent checkpoint, you know the exact amount of space you have to play the second 16th note. You simply need to divide the eighth note space in half and place the second 16th note partial exactly in between the spaces of your right hand. Being able to divide space in this way is key to building consistency in your note placement for all of the subdivisions that we're going to be talking about today. It also goes without saying that you need to play along with a metronome and with your feet. In our next primer, you're going to rely heavily on these two resources, so working with them now is a great way to generate good habits. Lastly, approaching this primer with good technique is also important. The right hand playing the eighth notes should maintain constant legato strokes, but you want to give your left hand enough time to play a relaxed downstroke without squeezing unnecessarily. Making sure to match your heights is also vital, especially when you take your doubles to the bass drum. One hand is already a little quieter by default because it's on the opposite side of your listener. If you're not playing with even heights, this effect will be even more drastic. With all that said, let's attempt a few reps of this exercise that you're free to play along to. At this point, you hopefully have a good idea of the spacing that needs to occur between the two notes of your double. So our next primer will remove the training wheels and leave the note placement up to you. Use your feet to your advantage as well. We can see that for 2's that start on the downbeat, your first 16th note lines up with your feet, and for 2's that start on the upbeat, the 8th note that we were adding to provide you with a checkpoint is now being played by your feet and by the click of the metronome. Additionally, continue to exercise good technique through your doubles by matching the heights and relaxation between both hands. A double is really only one note on each hand, so think about how you would play one chord note on your right and left hands at a time, and apply that same sort of approach to this 8th note subdivision. With all of that in mind, let's attempt a couple reps of this primer now. You should now have a fairly good idea of the 16th note interpretation and the technique necessary to play doubles with good sound quality on your own. Maybe next, you might want to meet with a partner or with your bass line to apply your skills. For this video, we've created a complete lesson pack that contains not just the sheet music in this video, but additional exercises that you can use to play with a partner, as well as splits written for both 4 and 5 person bass lines so you can develop your timing together. If you don't have access to a bass line 24/7, our lesson packs also come with more than 100 MP3 play-along tracks at a wide range of tempos for every exercise in the pack that you can use between rehearsals. If these are tools you think you'd find useful, click the link at the top right corner to go download it now. Otherwise, it's time to move on to our next subdivision of an eighth note. As we discussed before, the 3 divides an eighth note into 3 sextuplet partials. This tends to be one of the trickier subdivisions to learn because unlike the other two, which are duple based, the 3 is triple based, meaning that there's no easy subdivision of the beats that we can use to make sure our interpretation is correct. When working with this subdivision, our Brents are going to be particularly instrumental. Here's the primer that we're going to be using. The structure is the same as the very first one we used, but with some sticking changes in the 8th note check pattern. These exist because the 8th note tagged onto the end of the 3 will now be played on the opposite hand that you begin with, so we've adjusted the check to adjust for that. Our goals for this exercise, however, are the same. The tag 8th note will allow you to feel the space you have to place 3 notes, and because of this, it's important that your 8th note accuracy is solid. Ensure that the first note of your 3 and the tagged 8th note are both on the musical grid. Once that check pattern is solid, you can start ensuring that the space between your 3 partials is uniform by keeping your rhythms even and without choppiness. Let's talk about some technique next. You might have noticed additional dynamic markings on some of the notes in our Brents. These tenutos, or half accents, are not intended to be interpreted explicitly. In this context, I want you to think of them as indications of additional energy for the notes that they're placed on. To explain why, let's talk about the concept of balance of sound across players in a bass line. When playing 3s and 4s, we're not playing just one note on each hand anymore. In the case of 3s, we're playing 2 notes on the right hand, and in the case of 4s, we're playing 2 notes on both the right and left hands. This introduces a new obstacle for us. On top of worrying about having good timing, we're also trying to get a consistent sound from multiple notes on one hand. This is especially critical to us as bass drummers. If the players in your line aren't playing double strokes with equal volume, this leads to a decrescendo on every single 8th note subdivision, and therefore an unbalanced sound. Even if your players' rhythms are correct, an unbalanced sound will make your splits sound disconnected and detached. Instead, we want to make sure everyone is playing 3 or 4 notes that are all at the same volume and height so that we don't get any variation in sound quality as a run travels up and down the drums. This is how you achieve balance of sound in a bass line, and it's an idea that young players don't really consider when they're just starting out. If you're really trying to maximize your playing ability as a section, take the time to improve your musicianship in this way. Let's take this information back to our primer. We know that a bass drum doesn't offer as much rebound as something like a snare or quad, especially at the lower end of the drums, and as such, we need to work a little harder to produce 2 strokes of equal volume on both hands. That's where the tenuto markings come into play. Think about putting more energy into the second note of each hand so that when you take these rudiments to the bass drum, you're already compensating for the loss of rebound and you can play 3 or 4 even notes. Lastly, like always, make sure you're never squeezing the mallet more than necessary and that you're giving yourself enough time to prep so that your 3s project without a harsh sound. Let's take a look at a few reps of this primer. Once you're confident that you're playing this primer with the correct timing and with great sound quality, it's time to remove the training wheels that our Brents provide and work on the timing on our own. Just like with the 2s, make sure you're applying the correct spacing between your 3 notes, use your feet in the metronome to fill in the checkpoints that were being provided by the Brents, and continue to work on the uniformity of the heights and approach between your hands. Here are a few reps of this primer. Before we move on, I want to bring some attention to another idea that will help you achieve a more balanced sound across your line. You might have noticed that my heights weren't as high as they were when working through the 2's primers. This is because of our goal to play all 3 notes as close to the same height as possible. There are very few people that can play 3 or 4 notes all the way flat at a forte height without over-squeezing or over-attacking, especially at higher tempos. By keeping the maximum height of your 3's and 4's closer to mezzo forte or 9 inches, your music becomes more achievable and it's easier to maintain a balanced sound across your bass line. It's time now to move on to some 4's. Unlike 3's, we're fortunate in that there are several ways that you can develop your timing for this subdivision. Upon closer observation of a 4, we can see that we're playing a double stroke on both hands. We can therefore start our journey to high quality 4's by first isolating the doubles on each hand using this primer here. Like I've already mentioned, the key to achieving a great quality of sound for these double strokes, and for the 4's later when we're playing them, is to focus on creating 2 equal strokes on each hand as opposed to losing volume and velocity on the second note. Avoid relying too heavily on the fingers and rebound of the drum, because this causes you to give up control over note placement, meaning your timing is at the mercy of how much the mallet rebounds. Instead, make the effort to use a strong wrist motion to motivate both strokes. Start at a tempo where you can play this primer on both hands with a relaxed touch and absolutely no decay in volume, and slowly work your way up from there. As you reach your threshold, you'll need to continue working around those tempos to develop your wrist chops. The stronger you get, the better your doubles will be at faster tempos, which means that when you're playing the actual 4, you'll be better at maintaining the blend and balance from player to player. With all that said, let's get into a few reps of this primer. Hopefully at this point, you've developed a great sense of how double strokes feel in both your right and left hands. So let's move on to bringing them together to play some 4's. Just like our process for 2's and 3's, we'll first develop good habits by playing the 8th note subdivision alongside our Brents. The goals remain the same: good rhythmic interpretation without a sacrifice in sound quality. By now, you know the drill. Let's finish off this lesson video by playing through a couple of reps of this 4's primer without the Brent tagged onto the end. Continue to strive for good rhythmic interpretation, great sound quality from note to note, and remember to keep building timing relationships between your hands and feet using the anchors that we've discussed before. And that's essentially it. By now you should have a great understanding of how to correctly rehearse 2's, 3's, and 4's in a way that will allow you to squeeze a little more value out of these seemingly simple bass drum rudiments. At this point you might be prepared to take your newly refined rhythms to your bass line. As I mentioned before, our lesson pack provides you with effective tools to break these subdivisions down further within the context of a full section by offering full-length 8th note splits for both 4 and 5-person bass lines, along with a full library of MP3s to play along to if you can't meet with all of your friends. And with that, we've reached the conclusion of this video lesson. If you learned anything new from the information here, consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel, and share this video with some friends that you feel could benefit from this lesson. Feel free to also visit our website bassdrumgroup.com, where you'll find more helpful resources as well as various ways to contribute to this project if that's something you wish to do. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to catch you in the next video. Peace.